had the suicide rate from the year 2000 remained the same till today, 400,000 more men would be alive than there are. That's more than were killed in World War II. Feelings are important, but they don't determine who you are. They just determine how you feel. What determines who you are is your action. So, create a system that you're proud of, that despite your feelings, you know what your next step should be. You can't change your destination tomorrow, but you can change your direction today, which will send you in a different destination 10, 15, 20 years from now. It's almost become taboo to compliment men, to tell them that they've done good. It's the fuel on which we live, and it is so wonderful when you do hear it. Things that I've heard years ago, I still go, yeah, wow, that really helped.
What is a good man?
To imply a good man obviously implies that there's a bad man, right? You can't have a standard on one side unless there's a standard on the other too. And to be honest, answering what's a bad man's a bit easier. Answering what's a bad anything's a bit easier. Anybody can point out flaws. It's very easy to find the dirt. It's a little bit harder to find the gold. And so when we think about a bad man, it's easy to look at like someone like Andrew Tate. And, you know, some people look at this guy and go, wow, look at everything he's achieved. What an incredible guy. And then other people who have more than 2 brain cells go, wow, that's incredibly toxic. Trafficking women, throwing around cash, you know, thinking women shouldn't vote or shouldn't, that you're allowed to hit them, right? Psychotic things. And so it's a lot easier to point at the bad things. What I tried to do was this. Every time I tried to define a man, I reached these mental, logical roadblocks. And where I'd say something like, well, what if he didn't have that? Does that make him less of a man? Right? To be a man, do you have to have a really deep voice? Okay, so what if the man with the most masculine characteristics in the world didn't have a deep voice? Well, what if you reversed it? What if the man with a really deep voice didn't have masculine characteristics? Who's more of a man? And so I reached these blockades where I realized if you try to define a list of things and make a man adhere to those things, and he's missing some, does that make him less masculine? And the answer seemed to be no in my mind, so I had to take a different route. And the route that I took was this. There's these challenges in our life that we can't get around. We've got 4 internal challenges and 4 external challenges. Internally, what I call the inner war, we have mental challenges, physical, emotional, and spiritual. And you can't get around these. Mentally, you have battles in your mind. Physically, you have battles with your body trying to gain weight while you eat McDonald's versus not and go to the gym. Spiritually, there's definitely something more there. Spiritually, I personally define as more of like a purpose than it is in a spiritual experience. I'm not so much talking about like church, although that might be a part of it. I'm more talking about a sense of peace and purpose in your life. And then obviously emotionally, men are very terrible at acknowledging those. And so we need to work with something there. That's internally, and you can't avoid those. Every single person's gonna deal with those. Alternatively, externally, what I kind of call the external gauntlet, we have financial challenges, social challenges, vocational or career-based challenges, and then relational challenges. And social and relational are different, right? Social might be more on the friendship side. Relationally might be more on the romantic side. Now, what's super interesting is that when you delve into the statistics behind each of these challenges, which I did, I found a disturbing trend. And the trend is not necessarily that men are doing terrible. That's not necessarily the message. The message is that if you compare what men were doing in 1970, 72, and you compare where they're at today, they're declining. And that's very interesting. I don't care so much about the men versus women thing. I don't see that as a battle. I don't want that to be a battle. That shouldn't be a thing. Best people should get hired for the job, regardless of gender. And I think everybody has their roles. But what interests me a lot is that there's this downward trend of men across all of them. Let me give you some examples. Physically, in 1970, 15% of men were classified as obese. Today, it's 40%. Right? Grip strength, which is a widely used proxy for overall strength, has declined rapidly. In 1985, men had an average grip strength of 117 pounds. Today, or at least in 2016, it's 98 pounds. So simply put, the average man today is heavier, slower, and more inflamed than his grandfather was. That's physically, right? Mentally, this is super interesting. In 1972, the year Title IX passed, which in the US is a way to ensure gender equality across a variety of different things, the college degree attainment percentage favored men by 13%. Essentially 13% more men in college than women. Now it's 15%, but it's the other way. Now there's 15% more women in college than men. In fact, in every OECD country in the world, there are more women with bachelor's degrees than men. And if you bring this back to high school and you take a look at the top 10% of any graduating class, 66% of them, 2/3, are female. Let's go back to the bottom 10%. If you look at the bottom 10% of any given class, 2/3 of them are male. So mentally, men are becoming these laggards compared not only to women, but to themselves 50 years ago. Physically, they definitely are. What's happening emotionally? Well, I think we know now more than ever, people are feeling isolated. Pew Research had this study where they said that 16% of men between 18 and 29 felt lonely often or always. Today, that's 28%. So between 2012 and just 2025, that study was done, it's almost doubled. And I know living in New York here, New York has more people than you could possibly dream of, and it's considered one of the loneliest cities in America. And so spiritually, or talking from a sense of purpose, men are now taking their lives at increasing rates. Since the year 2000, rates have almost increased 50% of suicidal ideation and then suicide itself. In fact, had the suicide rate from the year 2000 remained the same till today, it's risen, but had it remained the same, 400,000 more men would be alive than there are. That's more than were killed in World War II, right? And this one really shocks me. Financially, men are actually earning less than they were in 1970s if you take inflation into account. In fact, their wages have declined on average 13,000 after accounting for inflation. That's a 28% reduction in median purchasing power across generations, right? And on top of that, right, those are a bit more maybe internal, but structurally, there's just some really interesting things that are out there. Like, 70-year-olds in America are now 72% richer than 70-year-olds in America 40 years ago. So if you compare the 70-year-olds 40 years ago and the 70-year-olds today they're substantially richer. Amazing. 72%. What happens if we look at the 40-year-olds in that same statistic? 40-year-olds today are 24% poorer than 40-year-olds 40 years ago. And if you go to the 35, the 30, 25, 20, it follows more that trend than it does with the 70-year-olds. What that's basically saying is that this generational wealth transfer that's meant to occur is not occurring. And that's a systematic failure, right? So this isn't all on men, right? Men personally have to take agency, of course, and there's ways we can talk about doing that. But also systemically, there are things that have basically hindered the growth of men over time. And so, one of these, it's classic, neither median nor minimum wage has kept pace with inflation or productivity gains, and housing costs have outpaced both, right? That's ridiculous. Like, these sorts of things are, from a structural side, difficult to overcome, but nevertheless, there needs to be a balance of not only policy change, but also changes in our own lives, right? Just because the policy is against me doesn't mean I don't have to work out, right? I can work out. So I've obviously touched on a couple of different things here. This doesn't answer the question of what makes a good man. What it does say, though, is there are areas that can be somewhat measurable to determine where I fall in what makes me a good man. And what this really comes down to, for me, is the suicidal ideation piece. And the reason I say that is the number one reason men cite for committing suicide is a feeling of uselessness or purposelessness. Men need purpose. They need to feel useful. And if they don't have that, then that's where they begin to feel, hey, I'm not worthy of anything. I'm not worthy of life. Might as well not live. So the question is, how do we overcome that? How do we provide men purpose? How do we provide men utility? Now, in all of my research, I have come across a lot of great, mainly philosophers, psychologists that have done extensive research on this. The first that really delved into this was a man named Viktor Frankl, and he wrote Man's Search for Meaning. And people have probably read the book in the past. Absolutely phenomenal book. If you haven't read it, it will change your life if you take it seriously. What's interesting about Viktor Frankl is that he had studied either under or directly under or studied the works of two masterminds ahead of his time, Nietzsche and Freud. He actually directly submitted a paper to Nietzsche, who submitted it for publication when he was 16. Right, so Frankl was very interesting, and the reason I bring up those two figures, they had two different perspectives on what the purpose of life was. Right, and since we're talking about purpose and the need for it to hinder this suicidal ideation and therefore suicide, what are those things? Well, Nietzsche said that the idea was to become the Übermensch, right? And the Übermensch, which is something that he listed off in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is his kind of like pinnacle work, was basically this idea that you become a man separated from society. Right, and the separation from society means you think freely for yourself. These free thinkers, and you've heard about all these movements that are propagating free thinking and thinking for yourself. But this is a problem because it comes up with your own moral code, meaning you don't adhere to a code of other people. If that doesn't fall into your camp, then you won't go do those things. Okay, so we got this Übermensch on one side. What did Freud say? Freud said that everyone is driven by the Lustprinzip, or the lust principle, the pleasure principle. And the Lustprinzip basically said that we are driven primarily by pleasure. And anything that brings us pleasure, we go for. Anything that brings us pain, we avoid at all costs. That was his sort of undergirding for what drives people. And the problem with both the Übermensch and the Lust principle is they're both self-serving, self-seeking. The Übermensch, by design, is meant to be separated from society. If every single person separated from society, how do you have a society, right? And that doesn't make sense at all. It doesn't work. It literally is designed to tear families apart because you have to separate from them, separate from your work, separate. And so mentally that and logically that just doesn't follow. Freud's pleasure principle obviously doesn't follow because we can't just live a life suspended in pleasure, right? Pleasure will not bring you the satisfaction that you want, only in small doses, but it won't give you this sort of filling of your soul. And if you just followed your pleasures, people would do a lot of bad things. We've all seen that guy in the bar that's a little bit too old to be hitting on those people and being that drunk, right? That is the result of the pleasure principle. So when Viktor Frankl was taken into the camps by the Nazis, on which ideology did he rely, having studied under Nietzsche and under Freud? He realized that it was actually neither. None of these two were what people defaulted to in their human nature in order to survive. What he realized was that the people that held on the longest, that maybe made it through the camps or at least held on the longest, were the people that had meaning undergirding their existence. And these people, he said, we were stripped of everything, including our clothing. All we were now were naked beings. That was a quote from his book, when they were literally naked and they were malnourished and everything. So how did these people even have meaning? Well, he said it came in a couple of different forms. People either have meaning through their work and this longing to fulfill their work after the camps, meaning through people, a longing to see those people, or a meaning or a purpose through experience, meaning you're a person that derives their meaning from experience. But undergirding all of these, he had this absolutely phenomenal approach to defining what meaning is. He said this: in defining meaning for ourselves, we tend to ask of life what our meaning is. Frankl, in a genius move, flipped this process on its head. He said, as each situation in life represents a challenge to man and presents a problem for him to solve, the question of meaning of life may actually be reversed. Ultimately, man should not ask what the meaning of his life is, but rather he must recognize that it is he who is asked. In a word, each man is questioned by life, and to life he can only respond by being responsible. Thus, it is in responsibleness the very essence of human existence. What he's saying is this: responsibility is the core pillar of having usefulness, of having purpose. If you want more purpose in your life, get more responsible. Meaning, not just as a mature person, but like, go get a job. Go live outside of your home. Find a girlfriend, right? These things require responsibility. And he said, if you want to feel purpose, those things might seem challenging, but those are the things that will give you purpose. He has another one here. He says, your meaning in life and therefore your fulfillment is directly correlated with responsibility. And so you begin to see these pieces fitting together, right? Is it any coincidence that during the time we've seen unprecedented increases in male suicidal ideation and men leaving the workforces at rate we've never seen and living at home more than we've ever seen? More men are now living at home than we've ever seen, more than with a spouse or with a partner or a girlfriend. Right? Is it any coincidence that while that's happening, we're also seeing the highest level of suicidal ideation? Right? So these pieces fit together quite nicely, which is why I think this is true. Men commit suicide because, or exit themselves from life, right? Whether that's suicide or just being a degenerate in your basement, because they feel useless or purposeless. Why are they doing that? Because they don't have responsibility. How do we give them responsibility? Get out of the home. Encourage them to do things for themselves, not just rely on the world. But this requires two pieces. One, an internal encouragement from not only themselves, personal agency, but maybe their parents and their friends, but also those systemic pieces I mentioned, right? We cannot have this world where wages are being outpaced by housing and cost of living. Right? That doesn't make any sense. The wages need to at least keep up with them, and that is a structural piece. So there's a lot of pieces at play here, but at least that gives a nice description of where we can begin to define what a good man is. I'm going to pause there really quickly. What are we thinking?
Thinking about breaking this down a little bit, and one of them in particular I want to break down, what you mentioned was the pleasure pillar, which I think that is probably one of the things that convinces men they're not good, is they give into vices, or they have, I don't know if there's even a name for it, just something like, almost like a getaway drug from the stress and pressure of life. And it might not even be anything too extreme, might be just playing video games for an hour every evening or something like that. Like, nothing that's going to harm anyone. But can you be a good man while still battling your pleasures?
Yeah. The answer is yes. You have to think of this good versus bad thing as a spectrum, right? It's not like you all of a sudden cross this threshold and now you're a good man, but before 2 minutes ago, because you played 1 hour of video games, you're a bad man, right? It's not so much this like trigger or light switch that you can turn on or off. This is why I define them as challenges, right? Everyone has these challenges that they're facing, and we all have different vices, right? They say that every person is susceptible, not just men, but every person is susceptible to one of three vices. I think it's gambling, drugs, or sex, and one of those could ruin your life, right? And maybe some people have the trifecta. They have all three, right? We all have our different things, and for some people it might not even fall in those categories. I know people that have committed their life to video games. They love it. They think it's the be-all end-all. They'd prefer to live in a virtual reality and have their characters prestige 4 times on COD than they would put those hours into the real life. There's a lot of philosophical questions behind whether that is, bad or not, because, who's to say that life in the virtual world is any worse than this one? Well, I have my opinions on that. But all in all, if the reality out here is harder and harder to accomplish things in, then why not go to the virtual reality? This is the mindset of these men that kind of live there. Now, there's everyone needs their way of decompressing, right? Sometimes that's video games. Sometimes it's going on a run, right? Whatever. And there's things that are better for you or worse for you. Ideally, we're all approaching this ideal version of ourselves, meaning if I think that I have a problem with video games, which personally I was an addict of the first order. In high school, COD and FIFA were my life. And that was the problem, right? So for me, maybe not for everybody, but for me, I know if I get a taste, there goes my life, there goes my career. So I exited that out because that wasn't what I wanted to become. I saw this one quote recently. Who was this by? I think it was Jordan Peterson. He said, take any given action and do it 1,000 times in your mind. Who are you at the end of those 1,000 times? And when I apply this to something like video games, if I take 1 hour of playing video games, harmless, like you said, harmless. If I do that 1,000 times, where am I? And what's the opportunity cost of being a reader for those one hours or those 1,000 hours? If I translate 1,000 hours of gaming and who that Kirk is on the other end of that, and who's the Kirk at the 1,000 end of reading, I'm a much more interesting and cool guy if I read. And so now this is a challenge that I have to decide in my mind. I get to decide, am I going to be the video game guy or am I going to be this this guy that reads, and whatever it is, whether it's Harry Potter or Freud, right? Which one do I want to choose there? And then add on any other thing you could do with those 1,000 hours. So for me, that challenge in and of itself provides me some sort of desire to fulfill that potential. There's a gap there, and I want to fill that in, and I want to be the best version of myself, not just for me, but I got a fiance. I want to impress her. I want to impress my parents. I want my friends to be like, I'm proud to be friends with that guy, right? I can imagine be very difficult to want to achieve these things if you didn't have those drivers. But I think in our core, we want to be appreciated by the people we love around us. If we had a choice, would we prefer to hear you're trash and worth nothing? Or would we prefer to hear I'm proud of you? Normally it's the latter, right? And those things are what's kind of we can use as fuel. And this is also an encouragement to people to say, hey, tell people who you are proud of that you're proud of them more, because it does help. And this is one thing that Chris Williamson talks a lot, Richard Reeves talks about a lot. It's almost like become taboo to compliment men, to tell them, that they've done good. It's the fuel on which we live. And it is so wonderful when you do hear it, and you won't believe like things that I've heard years ago. I still go, yeah, wow, that really helped.
Well, let's run with this a little bit, because I know you've said these statistics about suicide and stuff, and from doing this show and speaking to people and things, I do see that a lot. I kind of read a lot of interviews with like suicide survivors or people that were on the cusp of it, and it is kind of boiling down to a lot of this not good enough, which is split in two, which is kind of what we're talking about in two different parts here. And you mentioned the being proud of someone and things like that. There's a lot of men probably go their entire life without ever being told that someone's proud of them. So for a man that's never heard "I'm proud of you," where does he fit into life nowadays?
Well, he's probably going to be, unfortunately, walk around with a feeling of dejection, and this is not uncommon. This is probably the most common. One thing I didn't mention, before I mentioned how men are falling off relative to their grandfathers. That's true for the bottom 90% of men. But what's very interesting is if you look at the top 10% of men in 1970, and you take a look at the top 10% of men in our 2020 era-ish, the top 10% today are wildly more successful, right? To give you an example, financially, in the 1970s, there was a ratio of about 271 to 1 for the median employee salary and the CEO salary. So if you made 70K, they'd make about 1.2 million. Today, that same CEO would make 23 million, and the same employee would make 70K. So the top 1% of men are having the time of their life. But what's the problem is there's this growing gap between this bottom 90 and top 10. In fact, they're literally going in different directions there. So the man that's never heard this, right? Is that an issue of him, or is that an issue of the people around him? And it's a little bit of both, of course, right? People are more likely to say that's impressive if you do something impressive. But some people, they find it, and I've definitely struggled with this, they find it difficult to compliment somebody because to compliment somebody seems like you're not good enough yourself, right? And so to say, wow, you're so good at that almost makes it feels internally like, well, I'm not good at that, right? Or I'm not as good. Or maybe I am as good, but I don't want to say it because I don't want you to catch up, right? And this battle for ego is really tough. It's a really tough thing to deal with. And I don't know how to handle that battle other than constantly reminding yourself that someone else's success is not in competition with your own. There's not a limited amount of success to go around, right? There's not. We can all push that, whether that's in the form of compliments, or it's in the form of financial success, or it's in the form of familial success. Right? There's lots of different kinds here. Someone else having it doesn't mean that you can't. It's not a threat to you having it. So taking that internally, what that means is tell more people you're proud of them, right? A lot of the time you can change your own mood by telling somebody how happy you are for them, right? You might feel alone, but you tell somebody how they're such a good friend, right? You feel less alone. You might feel sad, but you tell somebody how happy they make you, right? And now you feel happier. And this kind of reverse mechanism, this kind of a positive feedback loop, where if you tell somebody something, you feel it yourself, which allows you to tell more people which you feel yourself even more, right? That's the same as the negative feedback loop, which is when you don't say it and you feel even more dejected, and so you're less likely to say it still.
I'm going to take form of a hate comment here now, because there's something that popped into my head straight away when you were giving that definition. And I'm going to say it in the third person so maybe people can feel it a little bit more when I ask it, and hopefully your answer then hits their hearts a little bit more. What if I don't feel I'm impressive?
Well, feelings are fleeting. The average feeling lasts 30 seconds, according to Anna Lubka from the University of Stanford. And they don't last forever, and they can come and go. And anybody who's learned a language before will tell you that sometimes after a day of learning a language, you feel like you're fluent, and the very next day you feel like you're completely inept in that language. And I would say the feeling, while important, doesn't matter to objective reality. You might not feel a certain way, but that doesn't mean that that's not true. So let's just say you focus on the feeling and you listen to it nonstop. Well, that feeling is going to tell you to not improve, right? I'm not impressive, and therefore I don't want to try to become impressive. Okay, well, now you don't work out. And now you don't put in the extra hour at work. Now you don't try and pursue the girl at the bar and talk to her, right? Whereas if you ignore the feeling entirely and you focus on what's good, what you already know to be good, it's good that I work out. It's good that I try at my job. It's good that I move out. It's good that I go and talk to the girl, even if she says no to me, and the next 9 will too, but one of them says yes, right? If you remind yourself of what's logically true, despite the feeling can be there, but sometimes the feeling won't be there, right? If we design our life based on feelings alone, we're going to live in a roller coaster. So this is where we introduce the concept of systems, right? John C. Maxwell introduced me to the concept of systems in his book, The 17 Indisputable Laws of Leadership, something like that, where he said basically systems allow average people to perform at extraordinary rates. But without systems, even extraordinary people can only hope for ordinary results. And the reason is if I sit down, right, and I've done this many a time, and I say, Kirk, what's your perfect day? If you could live the perfect day, one where you go to bed and you're so proud of yourself, what would that day be? And so I start writing. I say, well, there'd probably be a glass of lemon water there in the beginning of the day. So I'd have my water, feel hydrated and refreshed. Then I'd grab my coffee and I'd sit down and read my book. I read a lot, but I hate it. Oh my God, I hate it. So do the things you hate in the morning. That's when you have the highest amount or the least amount of ego depletion, which is essentially willpower. So I sit down.
Eat the frog.
Yeah, exactly. So I sit down and I'll read my book. And then I go, it'd be really nice if after that I went and worked out, because I want to get that out of the way before I start my work day, so I don't need to think about it. Awesome. So those are a couple things. Now I have a hearty breakfast. I do my work. I do my work for the day. And then maybe I catch up with a friend and hang out with somebody, FaceTime my mom or dad, right? That to me is an ideal day. Maybe I work on a startup. Maybe I learn a language. Maybe I read some more, whatever. Right? If I've designed that, I now don't need to think the next morning about what I should do, because I've already designed it. I've already designed the perfect Kirk, the ideal state Kirk that I want to achieve, regardless of my feeling the next morning. If I wake up feeling dejected, like I'm a loser, like I can't do anything, I know that I can just do those things and I'm likely going to feel better, right? This idea of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, it basically says that your feelings, actions, and thoughts all influence each other, which is very interesting, because that means if you're not feeling a certain way, you can act in a certain way and your thoughts and feelings will modify. And if you are feeling a certain way, right, you can use that to motivate yourself to do other things. So, like, if I could go back to the start of your question, feelings are important, but they don't determine who you are. They just determine how you feel. What determines who you are is your action. So create a system that you're proud of, that despite your feelings, right, you know what your next step should be.
Fair enough. So I want to invite the idea of good man back into the room here with probably quite a hard way of bringing it in. And to be honest, and I'm thinking more and more, it's probably a bit harsh on some people listening, but you mentioned a lot of statistics there. And you've mentioned toxic masculinity, which is unfortunately a brush that men are getting painted with a lot now. And I do see that there are a lot of men that don't have any of the traits at all of these people, but are still getting branded with it. And I want to know from you and your experience and your research and ideology and stuff, are we actually aiming to be good anymore, or are we aiming to not be bad?
Well, I can't speak for everybody, but I would likely say, like most things, it's probably a little bit of both. On the one hand, you've got people that are just trying to survive and get by, and they're probably aiming to just not be bad. On the other end, there's people looking for optimization. They feel pretty good in right now, but they're looking to go to that next level, be that next level better. And likely that's determined a huge proportion by where you were born in this world, right? If you were born in America, you have an incredible head start against somebody that was born in Sri Lanka, right? It's just, there are different starting points based off of the society that you were born in. Now, does that hinder your ability to progress? Not at all, right? Some of the most successful people we see in this world have been immigrants from various countries to other various countries, fighting against all odds. So the important point right there is, it doesn't matter where you started, right? Your personal agency can determine where you're going to end up. You can't change your destination tomorrow, but you can change your direction today, which will send you in a different destination 10, 15, 20 years from now. So I would say, as a society, which one are we working towards? There's definitely been a identity mismatch, right? You have this world of Instagram, of Facebook, where people are showing the best versions of their life. I would have liked to have thought, that people have moved past this idea that what's out on Instagram is real life, right? When back in 2012, when Instagram started being a bit of a thing, everyone was like, wow, my life sucks so much because their life is so cool, not understanding that that's just the one good moment of that person's entire year, right? No one's posting about the fight they just had with their boyfriend or whatever. But I don't see people acknowledging that truth. And so there is this comparison. And as a result, there is this, I'm just going to be good enough, right? Not striving to be good. I'm just going to be not bad so that I can be good because I got other things to focus on due to this world of sort of comparison here. So probably a little bit of both, which is an unfortunate answer, but I'd like to think it's trending towards the doing good side. I mean, if you take a look at Gen Z has all of a sudden stopped drinking. Gen Z is drinking 30% of what the millennials were drinking, which is wild. The alcohol sales are falling off like nothing we've ever seen. The other thing is they're jumping back into church, right? At unprecedented rates. The Gen Z world is obsessed with religion. It's so interesting. And this is kind of that pendulum swing where people go left towards, the liberal left and then come back to the conservative values and then swing back and forth. And we're kind of seeing that with these generations here. But all of a sudden, it's become cool to be in touch with your spirituality again. And everybody seems to be jumping back into it, which is probably a good trend, right? If you believe that religion created science, which Kepler, Newton, John C. Lennox all say it did, then perhaps it's a good thing for society as a whole that there is this trend. So that'd be my thoughts there.
It's a good thought. And I mean, a lot of these questions are quite like, they're coming from a place of quite darkness and stuff, because you mentioned those stats and it's hard to ignore. I mean, men have never felt worse about themselves now. Like, you look at, like, there was a behavioral scientist that was on the show that talked about one of his colleagues ran a survey just over brief websites on the internet and stuff. And he said the language men are using is 90% negative about something. It's not even always about themselves, which is the problem. They're being negative about anything. Like, questions are, why does this suck? Why is this not as good anymore? Why do I feel this way about this? It's not even like they're searching for answers. It's been more negative than ever. So this question is going to sound negative, but it's because of that trend. It's because of these numbers that you're telling us. But there will be people listening to this that, for whatever reason, put themselves in the box of, in the past I was bad. And like you said, we're defined by our actions, we're not defined by our feelings all the time. If a man feels he's been a bad man in the past, can he become good in the future?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's always second chances. And I think, you've probably seen those pictures in the past where someone goes, well, I've had a bad day. And then somebody shows them this picture of this square where the square represents how bad they're feeling. It's got like scratches and everything. But then they zoom out and that square was 15 seconds. And they say, no, you didn't have a bad day. You had a bad 15 seconds, and you're letting that ruin your whole day. The same thing can be applied to any measure of time. So if we're looking at life, if you felt like you were a drunk your whole life, let's take a classic Hollywood movie. You were a drunk your whole life. You had a terrible upbringing. You pass it on to your kids. You were a terrible husband and therefore a terrible father as well. Do you have to be a terrible grandpa? Do you have to be? You don't have to be. You're not obliged to be. Maybe you've broken a lot of trust. Maybe you have to work really hard to build back that trust, but you're certainly not out, right? And you're never too late to make a friend. You're never too late to start going to the gym or physical therapy to improve your body. You're never too late to go sober. All these different pieces are still available to you. You're never bad enough to be irredeemable. Now, I say that with some heavy asterisks, right? Of course.
I knew it was coming. I knew it was coming.
There's levels, of course, to it. But I would say we're talking to the average person here. And the average person could be anybody from somebody that's, never got attention in their life to a person that's coming out of prison for mass murder, right? At the end of the day, you can't rule out somebody. If you do rule out somebody, then you might as well have just given them the death sentence. Because what's the point of giving second chances if we say you can't have one actually? I would say a lot of this, though, you mentioned this, men have never felt worse. A lot of this comes from the challenge that I mentioned before, the social challenge, right? Experts now have this term for the friendship recession, right? 15% of men say they have no close friends. That's up from 3% in 1990, right? And 15% is already low, but 3% is, incredibly low. The number of men with 10 or more close friends has collapsed from 40% to 15%, right? And so that's another huge drop off. In the same year that the study was done, I think it was 2022, 45% of men reported that when facing a personal problem, they would reach out first to their friends. Now, that number is 22%. All right, so why did it go from 45 to 22%? Well, because the person they'd reach out to more would now be their parents. And why? Because they're living with them. 35% of men were living with their parents in 2014. That's like I said before, more than the number of people that were living with a wife or a partner, right? That hasn't happened in 130 years. In 130 years, we haven't seen that trend in the West. But now it's beginning to come back. One, because life's too expensive, but two, because life is so good that it's easy to baby people, right? When your biggest problem in life is that your straw is paper and not plastic, right? Then you complain about stupid stuff like that and not real things, right? I had this person once tell me, they said in Mexico, there's this saying, I think it was depresión es la enfermedad de los hermanos blancos. Depression's a sickness of the white boy. And that's because in Mexico, when you're just trying to put a roof over your head in some of these slums, you're not depressed. You get to work, right? You go to work and you just try to survive, right? You don't have time to be depressed. But when you see a plastic straw and a turtle and you let that ruin your day over here in America, right? It seems like the biggest thing in the world because we don't have real problems, right? And this goes back again to the responsibility piece. When you take on responsibility, you get purpose. And I think we need to push men more towards that. Jordan Peterson said, your purpose in life is to find the biggest burden that you can bear and bear it, right? And sometimes we can't bear a lot. That's okay. Just find the biggest one and bear it. For some people, that might be the ability to look after a family of 7. Great. Huge burden. 6 companies, huge burden, bear it, right? But for other people, that might just be looking after a family of 1 or their friend or just holding down a job, right? Everyone's got different capacities. The point isn't to be better than everybody else. The point is to be best for yourself.
Yeah, responsibility is a big one because we did speak about this with Trey Tucker, and whenever I used to do my newsletter, there was a guy that would read it all the time, and I knew him well, and he's a really good writer, and I was hoping he'd give me some tips, but he used to always reply to anything I spoke about stress or overwhelmness or pressure, and he would always say that your success in life is measured by how much stress you have at any given point and how much responsibilities you have at the beginning of every day. And I thought about it so much because he's hit the nail on the head. There's a problem with this now in today's society, though, which we spoke about so many times. We feel like if we have too much responsibility or we have too many things that we're responsible for, we get stressed, we get overwhelmed, we fall into pressure, and that's when the easy route then to go is the toxic route. Just hate on everything, say everything's the worst, the world's against me, things like that. But I don't. This is what the way I asked you the question at the start of what is a good man, because this is what I am so confused about, and I would love to do more podcasts on this topic, but I don't get it anymore, because when I was growing up, good man was based on his morals. What does he do? Could he get up every morning and go to work to support his family? Does he take care of the people in that family? Does he take care of his friends? Does he have some sort of good health? But now it seems that it's shifted so much now. It seems that you have to tick more boxes, and those boxes now are a lot more down the floor. Is the reason why we're struggling to define good is because good is no longer measured by your morals, but now social acceptance?
That's a great way of putting it. You know, if people tell me I'm good, even though they don't know me, then I must be good, right? Tom Holland has this great moment in his podcast with Jay Shetty where he says that he heard it from Robert Downey Jr., but he couldn't quite remember. He goes, if you have a problem with me, message me. If you don't have my number, you don't know me well enough to have a problem with me. And it's a great line. And it basically, it's forcing you to put in perspective who's really close to you and who's not. If the people around you have a problem with you, right, they'll probably love you enough to have an intervention. And that's great. Interventions are phenomenal things. It's a wake-up call, or they'll talk to you. But if they don't even know you well enough to have an intervention, then why do you care what they think? And that goes both ways, right? When I started my podcast and my YouTube channel, oh my God, the backlash that I got, right? I wanted to talk about issues of men. And from some of my closest friends, I got this backlash and I couldn't understand it, because I'm what you call in America a homer. And a homer is someone that just like, they believe in their team. They want what's best for those around them. And so when somebody tells me they have an idea, I jump all over it. I'm like, hey, how can we make it happen? Right? I'm going to help you out. And I'm connecting people and I want to help them. So I just assumed, perhaps blindly, that when I started to endeavor on something, I would get support. And don't get me wrong, there were definitely those people that were supporting me, and I very much remember who they are. But then there's those people who didn't. And what do I do with that? And you have to really evaluate, like, are they close enough to me to have the right opinion? One funny moment, one friend, he was challenging me. He's like, you know, who do you think you are to talk to men and tell them what they should do with their life? And I was like, where's that comment coming from? And he goes, well, that's what you're talking about. And I said, no, it's not. I haven't told anyone what to do. Have you watched the videos? And he goes, no, I haven't seen the videos. I'm like, what the heck are you talking? You can't judge my channel without watching the things that make up my channel, right? And I realized a lot of the time, and this helped me so much, people love to have opinions and they love to talk trash. It's a human nature. Let me tell you one thing that'll blow your mind. There's this book by Steven Pinker called Enlightenment Now. And he says, why is it that even though the world is getting better on every measurable metric, right? Human mortality's down, climate change is down. Like, it's incredible how well the world is doing. Deaths at births are down. We can produce more crops with less land. Everything's getting better. But yet every generation would say, oh, this world's cooked. This world's terrible. Why is it? And he goes, because psychologically, we believe people are smarter for saying things in the negative. He goes, let me give you an example. And he cites this study where people had to read 2 reviews of a movie. Okay. One was a positive review. One was a more negative review. And they didn't have to watch the movie. They just had to read the reviews and then determine which of the 2 reviewers was smarter. And 82% of the time, the negative person was smarter. The catch? It was the same reviewer, same writer, right? But even though it was the same writer, written in the same prose, right? They said that the negative one was smarter. We are inclined to think the person that says, well, that's a problem because, is smarter than the person that says, I don't think it is, right? The person that can judge all of the solutions and say that they're not actual problems, or judge all the, let's say, obstacles and say, no, they're not actually problems. They're seen as less intelligent than the person that identifies the problems in the first place, right? And so when I look at situations and things like this, people are compelled to talk negatively. And especially when you put a screen between me and the next guy, of course I can be a little bit more coarse with him, right? Like Louis C.K. does this great skit where he basically says, can you imagine if we spoke to people in elevators like we speak to them when we're driving on the road, right? Like, and like the things we would say in those elevators, like you piece, this that never happens in person, and it's because on a screen, I don't know who you are, I don't know your dramas, your family challenges, I don't know what you've been through. There's no humanity to it. You are just, Munch and Gobbler 457 right on my screen, and I'm just responding to that username. So I try to worry less and less about even what people close to me say, not so much as to be that ubermensch that I spoke against, but because even some close people truly don't want what's best for you, right? There's an inner circle of people that really do, and it's quite small.
Yeah, the negative opinions holding more stim is so funny because I had a comedian on called Danny Johnson who he used to work in a university somewhere in America, but he done a brief period where he was in Cambridge University in London, and he told this story of one of his friends that was professor had that he taught. I think he taught literature, but the class was so big it had to be split in two. So he was like, "I'm going to run a little bit of an experiment here," because he started realizing that when people in his class were saying to the rest of the class that this book or this paper wasn't good, they were really struggling to focus on it and learn about it and even pass the test that he was bringing to them just to see if they were actually doing the work. So he goes, "I'm going to run an experiment here." First class comes on in the morning and he tells them about this movie that he saw at the weekend. And he's like, "This is unbelievable movie. Honestly, it was great. It was the storyline, the editing, everything. It was amazing. Best movie I've ever seen. I'd recommend it to you all." The next class comes on and he tells them about the same movie, but he says it's horrible. Says everything's horrible about it. He names actors and says they're horrible in it. I will never watch them in anything again. He then walks outside and he goes to the people that are watching the yard at lunch. He goes, "Listen, go and walk around and eavesdrop. I want to see something. Come back to me." And he comes back into the classroom after lunch and he says, "What were they saying?" And they're saying they're talking about this movie and they're having these real back and forth argument stuff. He goes, "Well, what did that person there say about it?" And said, "Oh, they were saying it was amazing. They were telling people about it that they should go and watch it this weekend." And he goes, "What were the other people saying?" They're saying they were going back at the other people. They were telling them that it was horrible and they have no taste in movies or entertainment or anything. And he comes back into the classroom and he brings everybody in and they're all cramped under this thing and he goes, "That movie didn't exist. I wanted to show you is that you only base your opinions on anything based on what other people tell you. So the fact that I told you this movie was good or bad, you just ran with it. You didn't even go on your phone. You could have went on your phone and Googled the title of the movie and you would have saw it didn't exist. But they all ran with it. And it is completely true. That's why toxic masculinity holds so much steam now, why men are starting to feel like this, because we're holding them to that standard, not an actual standard of good. Does that make sense?
It's so true. Oh, so true. It reminds me of another study. This things we make up in our mind. There's that one where they tell people you're going to go for an interview, but we're testing how disfigurement of the face can determine whether or not you get the job or not. So they'd put all this incredible work into this this scar that would go in their head, just a subtle one, but a scar nevertheless to make it look as realistic as possible. And just before they went into the interview, they said, "Okay, we're going to touch it up." So they would touch it up and they'd remove it entirely. And when the people did the interview and then came out, they purported severe discrimination based on their injury that wasn't there in the first place. Right. And it's just these things. If we suspect something to be the case, we're going to talk about it. You've probably seen all these videos where people, they'll go into the streets and they'll say, "Hey, what do you think about this comment by Donald Trump?" And they'll say it and they'll be like, "That's terrible. I can't believe they said that." And then they'll switch it on them and say, "That was actually Kamala Harris," or "That was Joe Biden," or something. Or they'll say, "What do you think about this policy from Kamala?" And they'll say, "It's a great policy." And they'll say, "That was actually a policy from Hitler. That was from his speech in 1940, whatever." And it's just, if you don't take life at reality, if you just expect things based on whatever you're creating in your mind, you're not living in reality. You might as well go play video games, right? If you take reality as it comes, and there's also obviously a humility to this because it requires you to constantly question what you're seeing, then you're going to be in a much more positive situation to make real judgments about life, right? And so I guarantee you ask anybody today and they'll say this generation is the worst generation we've ever seen. But have you considered the technology we've come up with in this generation? Like, look at AI, right? Now, we've stood on the shoulders of people before us 100%, but does that make us the worst generation ever? We take a look at the world and society as a whole. Is the world in the worst spot ever? No, but people would tell you it is, right? They're not actually looking at real empirical evidence. They're just going off of observation because they're living in their time, and in their time they think it's the worst, and so did the last 2,000 years of generations.
Are we too hard on ourselves then?
I would say the propensity, we probably are, but the propensity to complain is an ideal so attractive that even good people can't resist it. And I heard someone recently say that all complaining is a disillusionment with reality. If you're complaining about the weather, in your mind, you have dissociated from the fact that bad weather can occur, right? If you're complaining that, you have to work, you're disassociated from the reality that working's a part of life, and you got to do that, my friend, right? And so, I say the propensity to complain is what's kind of giving that hindrance. Are we too hard on ourselves from a perspective of life, or just what we are expected of ourselves? Maybe, but that again brings into the comparison piece of, are you hard on yourself relative to yourself, or are you hard on yourself relative to the people around you that you're looking at on Instagram? And my guess would be that people are putting themselves up against whatever ideal figure they want, and they're not just looking at what they have. It's a very fine line between saying, I want more of myself, so I'm not content, but I'm grateful enough to be content. Right? That's a very fine line to live in that world, but it requires constant reminding. And this is why prayer or meditation is so effective empirically, right? Not even just from an anecdotal perspective. Empirically, those people that pray or meditate, which seem to have more or less the exact same effect, seem to be more content with life, more grateful. And taking a minute, 5 minutes, just to think, what do I have? How much do I have? What could go wrong that hasn't been going wrong? And I'm so grateful for that, right? The same person that tells you that their life couldn't get any worse, watch one thing massively go wrong, that if they could go back a day prior, it would make their life perfect. Those were the good old days. But then, someone passed, or their dog died, or somebody got into a car accident, they got to deal with the insurance or whatever. Oh, a day ago, my life was perfect. But that was the exact same day that you were complaining about. Now, all of a sudden, it's perfect because something worse has happened. So what do we have today that didn't go wrong, that we can be so grateful for? That mind set shift alone, that's going to save you a lot of negative feelings.
Last question, which, I mean, a lot of people I think people are going to get a lot from this episode and stuff, but you can always, you always hear that thing, you can lead the horse to water, but you can't force him to drink it. And I mean, what people are going to hopefully, the main thing I want people to get from this is to make their own definition of what good is to them, so they can start to, like you mentioned about Viktor Frankl, who and every part of his writing always went back to this meaning versus success thing. You should look for your meaning, success comes after. But people are obviously having an issue with that. So people that are maybe feeling that they don't know whether they're good or bad, or maybe they're so much to the latter they feel they can't get to the first one, what's one question we need to ask ourselves
in order to get to where we want to be, sort of?
In order to get on a path where we feel we could be good people. A lot of people don't think they're good anymore.
For that one, I always say you should ask yourself the future you question. The future you question goes something along these lines. In a year from now, or 3 or 5, choose your timeline, you run into yourself. Who would you have to meet, your other you, your future you, to be absolutely delighted with who that person's become? And if you write that out and say this person has, they were so kind, they were so nice, they weren't easily angered, they had this much money, they lived near this person, this family, they had kids, whatever. You now have an ideal, right? An ideal version of you that you want to reach. Now, since you set a timeline, you can backtrack. If that's where I want to be in a year, what do I have to do this month to get there? What do I have to do for the next 11 months after that to get there? And that is encapsulating of everything we've spoken about today. What's your ideal? What do you define as a good man? Kind of like what you just said. What's your definition of that for your life, right? It's probably going to be pretty similar to most people around you, but just your version, your flavor of it. Now, how do I get there step by step? And even doing that mental experiment, even if you put nothing in place, you walk around and you'll remember what you said about who you want to meet. and it might push you one step further to doing the workout, to making the friend, to going to the girl and asking what her name is and if she likes, drawing or whatever. you know, that that alone will change the diagnostic process in your mind of determining who you want to be.
Yeah. Self-awareness or gaining some sort of it is a big thing. Like Jordan Peterson's got that question that made him pretty much made him famous, and it should forever ingrain him in history for it, which is that where he's on Diary CEO, I think, and he says, if you sit on the edge of your bed for long enough and think, what is one thing I should be doing, that I could be doing, that I'm not doing? What is it? And he said, you'll find the answer to what it is you're lacking in life. And I think about it so much because I remember doing it whenever I was I don't even remember what age I was, but I was so young and I did nothing about it for years. Never really. It was only maybe in the last maybe 3 or 4 years I've done anything about it. But it was always in my head, which would made it easier when I got to the point where I actually then went to try and do it. It was in my head forever. It was the whole way through. Even though I did nothing with it for probably 3, 4, 5 years, it was there. At least I knew it was there. It was almost like whenever you're studying for a test, you don't know when you're not going to get the test tomorrow. You could do 4 hours of revision. You're not going to get it tomorrow, but you know when it is at least. And questions like that to promote about a self-awareness, I think, are what men should be doing now more than ever when men don't really know who they are anymore.
That's a good one. I like it.
So, Kirk, it's all got time for today anyway, but Kirk, tell people where can they find you, what have you got out, and what's coming in the future?
Yeah, definitely. So I got a YouTube channel under my name, Kirk Kappelhoff. It's also on Spotify under what's called Loaded Chats, where we have the hard conversations so that you don't have to. And those two pieces are the main mediums that I'm having. I got some pretty interesting figures that come on the podcast. I won't tell you what I had because they're a bit too crazy to even mention. But you can definitely find me there. And on the YouTube channel, I also release a lot of the stuff about what we've talked about today. Anything new that's come out. The cool thing about the world of masculinity, or this manosphere that some people call it, is that it's an incrementally growing, let's say, movement. And so you can always keep up to date with what's coming out relatively easily. It's not this overwhelming flow of information. So those would be the two main places.